17 million becquerels of radioactive waste. That's what Soviet workers dumped into a single river every single day for 4 years straight, and you've probably never even heard about it. They told you Chernobyl killed 31 people. They told you Fukushima was contained. They told you nuclear power is safe. But right now, in 2025, there are villages where children are born with genetic mutations so severe that doctors have stopped counting. There are workers whose skin literally fell off their bodies while they were still alive. There are companies that calculated it's cheaper to let you die than to fix a broken valve. And there's a disaster so catastrophic that the Soviet Union kept it secret for 32 years, a disaster that was worse than anything you learned about in school. What I'm about to show you isn't just history. It's a pattern of lies, cover-ups, and corporations making calculated decisions about how many of us they're willing to sacrifice for profit. The official death toll from the world's worst nuclear disasters. Laughable. The real number is so high that governments around the world agreed to never speak it out loud. In the next 20 minutes, you're going to discover why they lied to you. You're going to meet the people who were erased from history. You're going to see exactly how your government and the nuclear industry calculated the dollar value of your life. And you're going to learn why the worst nuclear disaster in history isn't the one they taught you about. But before I reveal which disaster actually killed the most people, you need to understand what happened in a small town in the Ural Mountains that the rest of the world wasn't supposed to know existed. 1957. The village of Muslyumovo in the Soviet Union sat peacefully along the Techa River, where families had fished and farmed for generations. 7,500 people lived in 20 settlements along this waterway. They used the river for everything: drinking water, cooking, bathing, irrigating crops. Children played in the shallows during summer. Women washed clothes on the banks. It was ordinary. It was home. What these villagers didn't know was that 78 miles upstream, the Soviet Union was running one of the most secretive facilities in human history, the Mayak Production Association. This massive industrial complex was producing weapons-grade plutonium for the Soviet nuclear arsenal. It was so classified that it didn't appear on any maps. The workers there didn't officially exist. The town built to house them was called Chelyabinsk 40, but you couldn't find Chelyabinsk 40 on any map either. And every single day, Mayak was dumping its radioactive waste directly into the Techa River. Starting in 1948 and continuing through 1952, Mayak released approximately 100 million curies of radioactive material into the Techa River system. To put that in perspective, that's 2.5 times the radiation released during the entire Chernobyl disaster, except this was deliberate, sustained, and systematic. Workers weren't disposing of waste properly because there was no disposal system. They just opened the pipes and let it flow into the drinking water of tens of thousands of people downstream. The Soviet officials knew. Internal documents show they understood exactly what they were doing. They built a waste storage facility in 1953, but only after people started showing up to hospitals with mysterious illnesses that doctors had never seen before. Even then, they didn't stop all dumping. They just reduced it. Between 2001 and 2004, another 40 million cubic meters of radioactive slush ended up in the Techa River. People in riverside villages were receiving radiation doses up to 1,700 millisieverts, the equivalent of having an X-ray machine turned on while hugging it for hours. They drank this water. They ate fish from this river. They fed their children vegetables grown with this water. But the true horror was still to come. On September 29, 1957, at 4:20 p.m., a cooling system failed at one of Mayak's underground waste storage tanks. This tank held 80 million curies of radioactive waste, liquid waste so hot it was boiling. When the cooling failed, the temperature inside skyrocketed. The tank was essentially a massive radioactive pressure cooker with no release valve. At 4:22 p.m., tank number 14 exploded. The blast had the force of approximately 75 tons of TNT. It blew the concrete lid off the tank, a slab weighing 160 tons, and threw it 60 feet into the air like it was made of cardboard. A pillar of radioactive debris shot 2,000 feet into the sky, forming a glowing orange and red cloud that people could see for miles. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. Nobody outside the facility was warned. Nobody was evacuated. Nobody was told to stay indoors or cover their wells. In nearby villages, people stood outside watching the beautiful glowing cloud drift overhead in the autumn sky, not knowing they were being bathed in lethal radiation. The Soviet government didn't just hide what happened from the world. They hid it from their own people. The disaster was given the innocuous code name, Kyshtym, after the nearest town that appeared on maps, a town that was actually 55 miles away. In exactly 7 hours, 270,000 people would be exposed to radiation, but the real death toll wouldn't be known for decades. The radioactive cloud from Tank 14 moved northeast, carried by the wind. It was approximately 200 miles long and 30 miles wide, depositing deadly material across an area of nearly 9,000 square miles. This zone became known as the East Urals radioactive trace, a scar across the landscape that persists today. The contamination was extraordinary. In some areas, radiation levels hit 600 roentgens per hour. To understand what that means, a dose of 400 roentgens is lethal to 50% of people exposed. Workers sent in later to assess the damage could only work for 6 minutes before they reached their lifetime exposure limits. 6 minutes. Anatoly Mikhailovich was a civil engineer living in the exclusion zone. He kept a diary that wouldn't be discovered until decades later. His entry from October 3, 1957 reads, "The children are vomiting constantly. Olga's hair came out in clumps this morning. The officials came and took all our food but wouldn't tell us why. They measured us with strange devices and wrote numbers in notebooks but wouldn't let us see. I asked the man in the military uniform if we were in danger. He looked at me and walked away without speaking." Anatoly died 3 months later. His wife died 5 weeks after him. Both children died before reaching their 10th birthdays. But remember those 7,500 people I mentioned earlier, the ones living along the Techa River. Their nightmare had already been going on for 9 years before the explosion, and it continued after. By the time the Soviet government began evacuating riverside villages in 1953, entire communities were already dying. In the village of Metlino, doctors documented something they'd never seen before, a new disease they called special illness. Patients experienced extreme fatigue, uncontrollable bleeding from their gums and noses, and a peculiar brittleness to their bones. Children stopped growing. Pregnant women miscarried at rates exceeding 70%. The few babies born alive often had severe deformities. Maria Kalinina was 6 years old when the explosion happened. She lived in Muslyumovo, one of the villages that wasn't evacuated because officials claimed it was far enough downstream to be safe. "We didn't know anything was wrong," she said in an interview conducted in 2013. "We played in the river like always. My mother still cooked fish from the Techa. My grandmother grew vegetables in the garden right by the water. Everyone was getting sick, but we thought it was just bad luck. One family's problem, then another's. We didn't connect it." Maria developed thyroid cancer at age 14. Her younger brother died of leukemia at age 9. Her mother died at 43 of multiple cancers. Her grandmother's bones became so brittle they would fracture from normal movement. She broke her arm picking up a pot, Maria recalled. The doctor looked at her x-rays and asked if she'd been in an accident. Her skeleton looked like crushed glass. The Soviet government's official response to the Kyshtym disaster was silence. They classified everything. The hundreds of thousands of people living in contaminated areas weren't told they'd been exposed. Workers sent in to clean up, the liquidators, weren't given protective equipment or accurate information about radiation levels. They were just told to dig up topsoil, bulldoze buildings, and bury contaminated material in hastily dug pits. Between 1957 and 1958, 17,245 workers received radiation overdoses, not merely unsafe exposures. Overdoses, doses high enough to cause immediate cellular damage. But the Kyshtym explosion was just the beginning. In 1967, a drought dried up Lake Karachay, another Mayak waste dump. Wind blew radioactive dust across the region, exposing another 41,000 people. In 1968, Mayak officials admitted they were still dumping waste in the Techa River, 20 years after they started. The pattern was clear: corner cutting, cost saving, and complete disregard for human life. And this wasn't an aberration. This was standard operating procedure. A procedure that would repeat again and again, each time with a different name, but always with the same victims. Ordinary people told everything was fine while their bodies absorbed poison. Stop and think about this for a second. Right now, pull out your phone and search for Muslyumovo, Russia. Use satellite view. Look at that river running through the town. That's the Techa River, and in 2025 it's still contaminated. People still live there. Children are born there today who will carry genetic damage from radiation exposure that happened before their grandparents were born. The half-life of some of the isotopes dumped in that river is 24,000 years, which means that river will be deadly until the year 26,000. Now here's what they don't want you to notice. Kyshtym wasn't the worst nuclear disaster in history. Not by death toll, not by area contaminated, not by long-term health effects. It was the second worst. And both the worst and the second worst happened because of the exact same pattern. Governments and corporations knew the dangers, calculated the costs, and decided your life wasn't worth the expense of doing things safely. Did you notice what all these disasters have in common? Ignored warnings. Corner cutting, lies to the public. Workers told safety wasn't necessary, and when people started dying, the response wasn't to fix the problem, it was to hide the bodies. But what I'm about to show you about the aftermath makes the disaster itself look merciful. In the weeks after the Kyshtym explosion, Soviet military units moved into the contaminated zone. They wore standard uniforms, not radiation suits, just regular military clothing. Most didn't even have dosimeters to measure their exposure. They were ordered to evacuate 23 villages, which sounds responsible until you realize there were hundreds of villages in the contaminated zone. They evacuated 10,000 people and left 260,000 in place. The evacuations themselves were brutal. Families were given 2 hours to pack. They could take only what they could carry. Everything else, furniture, photo albums, family heirlooms, farm equipment, was left behind to be buried or burned. Houses were demolished. Wells were sealed with concrete. Entire villages were erased from maps. One evacuee, Vladimir Koserev, described soldiers shooting people's dogs and cats in front of them before forcing families onto trucks. They said the animals were contaminated, he recalled. But they shot them right there in the street, made children watch. Some dogs tried to follow the trucks. They shot them too. My daughter screamed the entire 30-mile drive. Those were the lucky ones. They at least knew they'd been exposed. The 270,000 people left in contaminated zones didn't learn the truth for decades. Meanwhile, strange epidemics appeared. Cancer rates in the region began climbing almost immediately, but Soviet doctors were forbidden from listing radiation as a cause of death. Death certificates said heart failure, pneumonia, natural causes, anything but the truth. By the 1990s, when researchers finally gained access to Soviet medical records, the real picture emerged. Among people living along the Techa River, thyroid cancer rates were 55 times the national average. Leukemia rates were 41% higher. Birth defects occurred at rates that were, in some villages, 7 times the expected baseline. But here's the truly insidious part. The contamination didn't stop. It accumulated through generations. Mothers who drank from the Techa River as children gave birth to children with genetic abnormalities. Those children grew up and had children of their own who showed cellular damage despite never being directly exposed to the original contamination. Dr. Myra Kosenko, who spent decades studying Techa River populations, published findings in 2007 showing that third-generation descendants of exposed individuals had significantly higher rates of immune system disorders, developmental delays, and chromosomal abnormalities compared to control populations. The radiation had altered their family lines at the genetic level. The environmental damage was catastrophic. Lake Karachay, where Mayak had dumped waste for years, became the most radioactive place on Earth. Standing on its shore for 1 hour would deliver a lethal dose of 600 Roentgens. The lake was eventually filled in with concrete, but not before wind had spread its contamination far and wide. The Techa River itself remains heavily contaminated. Studies conducted in 2015 found sediment with radiation levels exceeding 10,000 becquerels per kilogram, more than 100 times the level considered safe. Fish caught in the river today are still too radioactive to eat. As of 2018, Russian health authorities confirmed that 49 to 55 cancer deaths among Techa River residents can be directly attributed to radiation exposure. But researchers believe the true number is catastrophically higher, possibly in the thousands, with deaths misclassified or buried in incomplete Soviet-era records. And remember, this is just one disaster. The worst was still to come. Meet Alexander Yuvchenko. On April 26, 1986, he was a mechanical engineer at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. He was working the night shift. The Soviet government's immediate response to Kyshtym was to classify everything about it at the highest secrecy level. The disaster was designated an incident of national security concern, which meant anyone who discussed it could be imprisoned for treason. Doctors treating radiation victims were forbidden from mentioning radiation in medical records. Scientists who studied the contamination had their research confiscated. Foreign intelligence agencies detected unusual radiation levels in the region, but the Soviets insisted nothing had happened. This wall of silence held for 32 years. In 1976, a Soviet biochemist named Georgy Medvedev defected to the West. He wrote about the Kyshtym disaster, but Western nuclear authorities dismissed his account as Soviet propaganda designed to make them look bad. The CIA had intelligence confirming the disaster, but chose not to disclose it publicly. Why? Because they didn't want to spark anti-nuclear sentiment in the United States. American and Soviet nuclear officials had the same interest, keeping people from knowing how dangerous nuclear power really was. The truth only emerged in 1989 when Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, under his glasnost policy of openness, allowed researchers to publish findings about nuclear disasters. Even then, the full scope wasn't disclosed. Russian officials claimed only 200 people were seriously exposed. They said there were no immediate deaths. They insisted the evacuations were precautionary. All lies. Documents declassified in the 2000s revealed that Soviet officials knew immediately that they'd exposed hundreds of thousands of people to dangerous radiation levels. They chose not to evacuate most of them because evacuations were expensive and would draw international attention. Internal memos, now public, show officials discussing the cost-benefit analysis of evacuation versus acceptable losses from radiation exposure. They calculated how many people they could let die to save money. And here's the grotesque part. Nobody was ever prosecuted. Not the Mayak administrators who dumped waste in the river for 4 years. Not the officials who ignored safety protocols leading to the explosion. Not the bureaucrats who covered it up for 3 decades. Nobody went to jail. Nobody paid a fine. The Soviet nuclear program continued operating exactly as before. The legal battle for compensation lasted decades. Victims who tried to sue the Russian government faced a system designed to wear them down. Claims were denied because medical records had been altered or destroyed. Residents were told they couldn't prove they'd been exposed because dosimetry records were classified. When victims produced witnesses and physical evidence, courts ruled the statute of limitations had expired. In 1996, a Russian court finally ordered compensation for some Techa River residents. The amount, approximately $70 per person. For lifetime exposure to radiation that destroyed families across generations, the Russian government valued each life at $70. Compare that to the cost of proper waste disposal. Nuclear engineers estimated that building adequate storage facilities in 1948 would have cost approximately 300 million rubles. Instead, they dumped waste in the river and caused damage estimated at over 100 billion rubles in health costs, lost productivity, land contamination, and cleanup efforts. It was 97% cheaper to kill people than to protect them, and Mayak's administrators knew it. The facility remains operational today. Mayak still processes nuclear material. It's one of the largest nuclear complexes in Russia, and it's built on the same contaminated ground where the 1957 explosion occurred. In 2004, 2011, and 2017, environmental groups documented continued radioactive releases into the Techa River system. Russian officials denied the releases, then later admitted them, but claimed they were within acceptable parameters. Those same officials refused to define what acceptable parameters meant. This pattern of corporate calculation, deciding it's cheaper to let people die than to implement proper safety, wasn't unique to the Soviet Union. It's standard operating procedure in the nuclear industry worldwide, and it repeated with horrifying precision in 1986 at a place you've actually heard of, Chernobyl. April 26, 1986, Chernobyl, Ukraine. Engineers conducting a safety test on reactor number 4 disabled multiple safety systems to simulate power failure conditions. The test they were running was meant to prove the reactor could safely shut down in an emergency. Instead, at 1:23 a.m., the reactor exploded. 2 workers died instantly. 28 more died from acute radiation syndrome within weeks, but the official death toll of 31 is a statistical fiction. Studies tracking Chernobyl liquidators, the 830,000 workers sent to clean up, show that between 112,000 and 125,000 died before 2005. That's 15% fatalities among cleanup workers alone. December 3, 1984, Bhopal, India. Not a nuclear disaster, but the same pattern. Union Carbide's pesticide plant released 40 tons of toxic gas into a densely populated area. Official death toll, 3,700. Independent investigations, 16,000 deaths in the immediate aftermath, with 25,000 more dying from complications over the following decades. Union Carbide's response was to offer compensation of $370 to $500 per victim. The CEO, Warren Anderson, fled India and was never extradited. He died in 2014 without ever facing trial. March 11, 2011, Fukushima Daiichi, Japan. A magnitude 9 earthquake triggered a tsunami that knocked out cooling systems at the nuclear plant. 3 reactors melted down. Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, initially claimed no dangerous radiation had been released. In reality, they knew within hours that meltdowns were occurring, but delayed evacuation orders. 154,000 people were evacuated. More than 1,600 died from evacuation stress and complications. TEPCO executives were charged with negligence in 2012, but were acquitted in 2019. Nobody has gone to prison. September 13, 1987, Goiânia, Brazil. A radiation therapy machine containing cesium-137 was stolen from an abandoned hospital and sold for scrap metal. The scrapyard owner broke open the device and found a glowing blue powder inside. Thinking it was valuable, he distributed it to friends and family. 4 people died from acute radiation syndrome within weeks. More than 250 were contaminated. The Brazilian government buried the most contaminated victims in lead coffins, sealed in concrete. As of 2020, 47 of the original victims are still alive, still receiving treatment, still radioactive themselves. And right now, in 2025, there are hundreds of aging nuclear facilities operating with outdated safety systems. In the United States alone, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission documented over 300 significant safety violations at commercial nuclear plants between 2018 and 2023. Fines averaged less than $200,000 per violation. For comparison, operating a single nuclear reactor generates approximately $700 million in revenue per year. The math is simple: violate safety regulations, maybe pay a $200,000 fine, keep making $700 million. It's not that these companies don't know how to be safe. It's that being unsafe is wildly more profitable. This will happen again, not might, will, because the incentive structure guarantees it. Notice the pattern: Kyshtym, Chernobyl, Fukushima, Bhopal, Goiânia. Every single one followed the same script. Warnings ignored because safety is expensive. Corners cut because profits matter more than people. Disasters happen exactly as predicted. Official death tolls that are deliberately, systematically, criminally understated. Cover-ups coordinated between industry and government. Legal battles where victims are offered pennies while executives walk free. This isn't about bad actors or rogue companies. This is about how the system is designed. Corporations exist legally to maximize shareholder profit, not to protect workers, not to safeguard communities, to make money. When safety costs more than potential lawsuits, deaths, and fines combined, safety becomes irrational from a corporate perspective. You get spreadsheets with columns labeled cost of proper disposal versus cost of expected lawsuits from cancer deaths. And when proper disposal costs more, people die. It's not evil, it's math. Cold, ruthless, precise math that calculates the dollar value of your life and decides you're not worth the investment. After Kyshtym, Soviet officials calculated that evacuating and properly treating all contaminated populations would cost more than the economic value those people would produce in their remaining lifetimes. So they didn't evacuate them. After Chernobyl, Soviet and international nuclear agencies calculated that admitting the true death toll would devastate the nuclear power industry worldwide. So they agreed on a number, 31, that was politically acceptable. After Fukushima, TEPCO calculated that admitting the full extent of contamination would cost more in compensation than their company was worth. So they lied until the evidence was overwhelming. This is happening right now. There are facilities near your home operating with known safety defects because fixing them costs more than the likely settlements from future disasters. Right now, regulators who are supposed to protect you are staffed by former industry executives who will return to industry jobs when they leave government. Right now, companies are running the same calculations that killed people at Kyshtym, deciding how many deaths are acceptable to maintain profit margins. Unless something fundamental changes, you're just a number in someone's cost-benefit analysis. Now you know what they don't teach you about nuclear disasters. Not just the death tolls they hid, the hundreds of thousands who died slow, agonizing deaths from cancers that developed over decades. Not just the cover-ups, the coordinated lies between government and industry that continue today, but the reason why. The economic incentive structure that makes killing people more profitable than protecting them. You can research nuclear facilities near your home. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission maintains public records of safety violations and incident reports. You can contact your representatives and demand stricter liability laws that make disasters more expensive than prevention. You can support organizations that advocate for independent safety monitoring. What's the worst nuclear disaster you never heard of before this video? Drop it in the comments. And if you learned something that made you angry, good. Anger creates change. Hit subscribe. Only 8% of you are subscribed, and this channel exists to expose exactly these kinds of hidden truths. The next time someone tells you nuclear power is completely safe, ask them one question. If it's so safe, why do companies need liability caps protecting them from the full cost of disasters? They already know the answer.